I'm gonna bring together three themes in today's class, and they are not really related, but I think that they can all be brought under the same rubric. And this is the idea that there is a new normal, or the way I'm referring to it, three new normals in the politics and environment of the world right now. And I think, frankly, this poses real dangers for American politics and for the world. And I think in certain respects, all three of them came into focus this week in an intersecting way. I will say very briefly, they may offset each other a little bit as well. But let me not be so cryptic and get into what I'm talking about. The first new normal, as you know, I live in the environs of New York City, and this is what it looked like in New York City yesterday, the day before that, right? And so a haze that absolutely choked out the sunlight. It felt like a really gray winter in Northern Europe, not July in the east coast of the United States. And what was happening, of course, is that there was choking smog, dangerous particulate matters, not just right completely obliterating the sun and making it very difficult even to see, a couple hundred yards, but also dangerous for humans and presumably animal life as well. And in the sense that the particulate matter that gets into the stratosphere and then can travel thousands of miles, right? These fires are in Ontario and Quebec, also in Minnesota, and as you are probably aware, in Washington and Oregon. But the particulate matter that gets into the stratosphere is the smaller, lighter stuff. And it's the stuff that is small enough to enter the lungs and through the lungs enter the bloodstream and therefore to be very dangerous to human health. And so hundreds of millions of people were under advisories to remain indoors if possible, wear masks if going outside. And so the idea that this is something that really is all but unprecedented. Massive amounts of North America, of really the continent as a whole, burning, the forests burning, and creating these conditions that are so dangerous for everyone here. And I'll be very brief about this. If you look at an aerial map of North America that pays attention to the forest coverage, especially the big boreal forests of the northern United States and much of Canada, there is a supply of fuel for these fires that can burn for decades. And it's not going to be continuous. It's not going to be a perpetual inferno with all of the implications of that. I think of Mordor in the way that it's portrayed in The Lord of the Rings. That's not where we're going. It's going to be intermittent, but there will be episodic periods in which it will be not summertime and dangerous to breathe the air, dangerous for animal life, maybe biological life in North America for the foreseeable future. And this is because our climate has changed and this is the new normal. Our fire season is three times as long as it used to be. These fires are mega fires. They move faster, they burn more, they do more destruction. They are, in many respects, practically impossible to contain. They're too big. The fuel is too plentiful. They're moving too fast. The regions are too remote. And so we have to reconcile ourselves. This is where we are now. Um, I'll say more about climate change in a few minutes, but this is obviously the product of climate change. And this is where the planet will be for the foreseeable future, the first new normal. The second new normal that I want to point out and connect very quickly, this is what it looked like in Washington, D.C., when the hazy sky made it difficult to discern the outlines of the Washington Monument from the Lincoln Monument, right? That's the mall. That's the infamous reflecting pool separating those two. But please note who is stationed in the Lincoln Monument. That's a National Guard troop who has been deployed there. And I want us to recognize that the President of the United States is trying to create a new normal. The normal is military occupation of the capital of the United States. And of course, on Thursday night, Donald Trump gave a primetime address on the issue of election insecurity. We'll get into the details of it. It was laden with disinformation, manipulation of information, cherry picked and unreliable, formally classified information, all designed to undermine the confidence of the American people, or at least of those who are not going to like what happens in the 2026 election, in the reliability of our election system, which, despite what was said on Thursday night, remains basically resilient to interference. Its integrity is intact, but that is not what the President of the United States is saying. And note, ways that we'll get into, right? I'm playing with the theme of fire. I've got the Constitution on fire as well. Some of the smoke is coming from not the forest, but our institutions being set alight. And the idea that what Donald Trump is trying to do is to create conditions in which the American people cannot use the electoral institutions that our Constitution furnishes to hold accountable our elected leaders. That he's trying to undermine the idea that if that's what happened, that that is a legitimate outcome, and trying to create the pretext for using executive power, using the tremendous coercive surveillance and legal infrastructure, what is increasingly appearing to be a coalescing police state power in our federal executive branch to control the outcome of our national elections. The new normal, in other words, is that we have military in our streets, is that we have Homeland Security officials killing our fellow citizens and inhabitants of this continent, that we have a president declassifying and misusing national security information, not to protect the integrity of our elections, but to undermine our confidence in them or to manipulate their results. That's the second new normal. And I'm sorry to say, in ways that we discussed last week, the Supreme Court of the United States has made it much more difficult for our institutions to function in the way that they're supposed to resist autocratic legalism when it comes out of the executive branch. Third new normal, we have really resumed full-scale warfare with Iran in the last week. And I'm not going to talk very much about this today, but I want to be as clear as possible with you. Why are we again engaging in some of the most intensive bombing campaigns of this war, which goes all the way back to late February? Is it to bring about regime change? That was the original announced objective of the war. Is it to eliminate the nuclear program of Iran? Is it to eliminate their advanced missile capacity? And the answer to all of those questions is no. The reason we have resumed conflict with Iran is to try to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and to allow oil to flow freely and other supplies related to fossil fuels to flow freely through that choke point in the Gulf. And the new normal here is that Iran now asserts control over the Strait of Hormuz and demands that the world recognize their de facto sovereignty over an international waterway and that they act accordingly, follow only the pathways that Iran allows, and pay Iran and Oman money for the right to navigate this waterway. And I want to say one more time, I think this is the new normal. I think what this war has produced is a fundamental change in the way in which the world's supply and access to the supply of one of its most valuable, most important, most destructive commodities as well, fossil fuel, is now controlled by one of its most dangerous rogue regimes, Iran. And by the way, by the impetuous behavior of the President of the United States, you might say now another rogue regime. I'm not exempting us from that category. So the third new normal here, right, is that we have no idea really how to try to claw back the pre-war status quo, a status quo in which ships could freely navigate the Strait of Hormuz and the oil supply of the world was freely flowing, right? And so I'll say this very quickly. I don't see an end in sight because, right, it doesn't appear to me that we're going to be able to reopen the Strait of Hormuz using air power alone. Very quickly, we spoke almost a month ago, I think now, about the details of the memorandum of understanding that created this temporary pause in hostilities. It turns out, right, the terms of that memorandum of understanding allowed Iran to sell oil at market value. It appears that they took immediate advantage of that provision and have replenished their coffers via selling 5 million or more barrels a day for most of the last month. It appears that Iran can therefore withstand the American blockade that is choking its access to resources and revenue, perhaps for another 6 months for the rest of this year. Whereas I really don't think that Donald Trump can withstand the political pressure that the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz is going to generate because already gas prices are going up. Already his popularity, which had rebounded somewhat, not substantially, but into Joe Biden territory, when the temporary cessation of hostilities allowed the price of gas and other commodities that are related to fossil fuel prices to come back down. They're going back up. His popularity is going back down as we are now just months from a national election, as the primary season is drawing to a close. And so this creates dangerous pressures, either pressures for the United States to simply accede to the idea that Iran now has sovereignty over the strait, or to escalate this war further. But the even more dangerous pressure that Iran now controls is pressure over the global economy. How resilient or fragile is the global economy to the inflationary pressure that the lack of oil supply is now generating? I'll speak very briefly about the idea that some of the resiliency we've seen is for very encouraging reasons. Pakistan has now nearly 50% of its households with solar panels on their roofs. China has transitioned very rapidly. 60% of the new vehicles sold in China last year are electrical vehicles. 70% of those sold in Tibet are electrical vehicles. And as a result of that, plus stockpiles, China has reduced its oil intake by 5 million barrels a day. But it's unclear how long these buffers last and when they are eroded. It may be that we will begin to see what I think many people expected, which is the price of oil going up substantially. Right now, it's up at around, I think, $85 a barrel, but many people predicted it would be around $120 a barrel. And I certainly hope we won't get there, but it is entirely possible that we could. The the one silver lining in all of this is it does appear that the right conflict and its economic consequences are accelerating the transition away from fossil fuel. So with those three right themes together, I now want to spend a little bit more time on two of the new normals. The first is climate change, and more broadly, the idea that we are living in an era of global catastrophic risk, that we're replacing a resilient with a vulnerable world. I've drawn on the ideas, I'm drawing on the ideas of Nick Bostrom here, who was the head of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. I believe he's still a philosophy faculty member there. That institute was disbanded relatively recently. And he gives us this category, global catastrophic risk, where a global catastrophic risk is a risk that is transgenerational and terminal. And part of his claim is that for the vast majority of humanity, the worst kind of risk we encountered was an endurable global risk, like a pandemic. And as awful as pandemics are, as we all remember from history, they don't threaten humanity or biological life on the planet, as opposed to, right, leading to the deaths of millions of people. They're certainly not to be taken lightly, but that was the worst. And since then, we've moved into the level of transgenerational and durable and terminal risks. The idea that climate change, that artificial intelligence, that nuclear warfare, or biological warfare, at least those, right, easily named possibilities, carry the risk of human extinction or the extinction of biological life on the planet. We, one species on the planet, can potentially extinguish not only our civilization, but all of human life or potentially all biological life. We are poorly equipped to understand, to cope, to really let it work on us that we have entered a new era of planetary history, and that we are now responsible for shepherding the planet, for minimizing our impact, and for mitigating the worst outcomes of our impacts on the planet. And we are, right, seeing the outcomes of this. We see it with the haze in the air in large portions of the United States. We see it with the two recent heat domes that led to nearly 20,000 deaths in Europe, right? And the prevalence of record heat going up year by year, right? And please note, the environment as a whole, the climate as a whole has been destabilized. It's also increasing cold records because of the destabilization of the jet stream. But the planet as a whole in 2026 is much hotter than it was in the pre-industrial period, and there's no end in sight. And by the way, it is about to get much worse. And when I say about to get much worse, I'm talking about a short-term development that appears to be taking hold in the Pacific Ocean. We are due for an El Nino. It is taking shape, but as I've said to you before, this appears to be an El Nino, which is an oscillating tidal or current pattern in the oceans that is of a magnitude that we see once every 150 years. And the last time there was one of these truly super El Ninos, 30 to 60,000 people, I'm sorry, 30 to 60 million people died from famine, from drought, from extreme heat. And obviously, 150 years ago, we did not have the technology to allow us to cope with it as well, but we also had billions of fewer humans on the planet. We don't know what this El Nino will do, but it seems that we are increasingly living in a world where we are more vulnerable to these regular, natural phenomena, things like the wildfires or the El Ninos. And when the El Nino happens, this is the map of what happened in 2023. One way to put this, right, and many of us have been dealing with high heat recently. Imagine turning on the heat in your home or your car, blasting it in the middle of July, right? This is, in essence, what the magnifying effect of El Nino on top of climate change is going to do to us in the coming year. And so I'll say this very quickly. This is going to be compounded by the fact that the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't only prevent oil from getting out, it prevents fertilizer from getting out. And so farmers are doing without fertilizer. El Nino, which, as you can see with these super El Ninos, is likely to drive the temperature on the surface of the planet on average up to 1.7 degrees higher than it was in the pre-industrial period. You put drought, heat, torrential monsoon rains in certain areas, and lack of fertilizer together, and you have a recipe for famine, fire, flooding, and political destabilization. To put it differently, in 2027, we're likely to see temperatures hit 1.7, maybe 1.8 degrees above the pre-industrial average. When the last climate panel report came out, 2018, it contrasted what 1.5 and 2 degrees of increased temperature on the surface of the planet look like, and the results were sufficiently alarming. The number of species that die, the number of regions in the world that become uninhabitable, the level of sea rise, etc., that it led the countries of the world to shift from a 2 degrees to a 1.5 degree target for containing climate change. We're about to see what it's like to go over 1.5 degrees. The question, it seems to me, is whether this will be a terrible learning opportunity, a chance to see where we're headed and to maybe with clear eyes encounter for a brief period what will be the new normal if we don't immediately begin to act on climate change in a more effective way. Let me just share a little bit of the good news with you. And this, I think, is quite remarkable. All new global electricity generation capacity created in the last year, 2025, is from alternative energy sources. A little bit is natural gas, but the decline in the use of coal more than compensates for that. Just note what I just said, right? We as a species are greatly increasing our demand for electricity. We're building out all these data centers all over the world, and they are hungry for electricity, but in order to power them, we are turning increasingly to alternative energy sources. That is really good news. The bad news in all of this is, well, first, that it's still a small portion of the overall electricity generation. It is growing rapidly due to economic considerations, somewhat due to policy considerations, but it really just is that China is producing so many solar panels, so many wind turbines at this point, that it has become much more economical to build alternative energy as opposed to fossil fuel-based energy sources. Now the bad news, right? And so the idea that for whatever reason, and I think I know the reason, the Democratic Party has stopped talking about climate change, right? The Republican Party never talks about climate change, but as you can see, right, the percentage of congressional press releases mentioning climate change peaked in the Biden era, but has gone down substantially, actually below where it was in the first Trump administration. Why? Well, it's not because Americans are not concerned about global warming. Actually, our concern is near the highest point that it's ever been. I think it's because there is a fatigue to do with crises, whether it's artificial intelligence, COVID, Iran, affordability. There just seems to be too much bad news in the air to pile on with something else, right? So let's just not talk about it. And this is now being called climate hushing. The Democrats still care about this, would still perhaps legislate on it, but if you don't sustain public discourse on it, it's hard to make progress. And I will just say this very briefly. One of the questions that will be interesting to track as we go forward is whether 2027 being a much hotter year, if the El Nino comes to pass in the way that most people think it will, then will the Democrats begin to focus on this again? All right. The other new normal that I want to focus on with you today was on full display Thursday night. And the majority of the networks did not cover Donald Trump's primetime election interference speech because his history of propagating disinformation is so clear on this subject. There are very few things that Donald Trump seems to focus on and consistently maintain, right? You know, the idea that one day last week we were talking about the United States would keep the Strait open and charge its own toll, and the next day he withdrew that idea, right? Very inconsistent. And by the way, just to go back to that for a second, the idea that we don't tend to think one step ahead, that we gave Iran the immediate ability to gain substantial new revenues in the Memorandum of Understanding without anticipating maybe they would use that money to be able to insulate themselves against future economic and military pressure from us, is indicative of this administration. But one place Donald Trump is consistently focused and seems to have the capacity to play the long game is in undermining the confidence of the American people in our election system and in building up the pretext to justify executive interference in the forthcoming elections. And so in Thursday's speech, if you saw it, if not, I'll give you a little bit of a very brief, it really doesn't merit analysis so much as description. The president used cherry-picked classified national security information and misused it, right? Misdescribed what it said or used stuff that was not stuff that the agencies gathering it had much confidence in. They didn't think it was necessarily accurate or reliable or gave the full picture, but it suited Donald Trump's propaganda and disinformation purposes to say that the 2020 elections were meddled with, were ultimately rigged. And more importantly, I think at this point, using that as a pivot to say, and we have to protect the elections of 2026. And what that really means is that the executive branch has to have much more control over those elections. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? We know what they're trying to do. I'll get into some of the details in a minute, but they're trying to manipulate the outcomes of the forthcoming election. They're trying to disenfranchise citizens who are eligible to vote or to dilute their voting power. And this is the autocratic metric. You cannot win the election fair and square based on the merits because your policies are too unpopular. So attempt to alter the outcome of the election so you don't allow the electorate to hold you to account for your unpopular, destructive policies. This is the Department of Justice, right? And again, I look at this and I want to say this looks like a science fiction computer generated graphics image, but it's not. It's a real banner hung on the front of the Department of Justice, right, with Donald Trump's scowling visage 20, 30 feet high, right, make America safe again. And the idea that we shouldn't lose track, right? So far, the rhetoric of Thursday night speech has not borne any fruit in terms of the Senate's willingness to pass the Save America bill. That was the underlying point of all of this, was to pass voter disenfranchisement legislation, voter suppression legislation. It doesn't look like it's working, but we should not lose track of the fact, right, that the Department of Homeland Security, I've got Mark Wayne Mullen here, who announced the day after that he's going to pursue criminal prosecution against local state officials who don't turn over the information or comply with his demands, which are illegal, unconstitutional demands premised on disinformation. Just be clear about that, right? The idea that this is a weaponization of what should be independent agencies that are there not as the playthings for the partisan, power-hungry agenda of the President of the United States, but instead to do the work of the people of the United States, that these institutions and agencies were created to do. Their enabling legislation also constrains and guides their power to do certain things, and this is not what they're being used for. So this allows me to segue for a moment to where we left off last week, and the idea that the Supreme Court of the United States has been captured by a patient, long-term, expensive campaign to remake the majority of the federal judiciary to not evolve in the way that it has traditionally evolved, right? Judge by judge, justice by justice, appointing the best legal minds, those with the possession of the judicial virtues, willing to check their partisanship as they don the robes, and to instead manifest a principled commitment to the rule of law and the values of the Constitution. 6 out of the 9 justices emerge from this campaign, which essentially captures the court by a vested interest, and in that sense corrupts the very reason for the existence of the court. The reason we let these 9 people have so much power, serve for life without ever having to win an election, without any mechanism of accountability, is because we assume they're doing non-political constitutional work. And the idea that now we have to get used to another new normal, the majority of the Supreme Court is committed to an agenda that does not reflect the sovereignty of the people of the United States or our opinions on what our Constitution means. They reflect the ideology of the group that paid to remake our judiciary. This is a captured court. And I'm now going to move very quickly to the overlap between the views of the majority of the members on the Supreme Court and Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again movement. And so I want to suggest that there is a right overlap, a confluence, not an identity, right? These are not the same thing, but between the conservative originalist legal philosophy and the Make America Great Again political ideology. The background assumption here, and I'm drawing again on Laura Field's book, Furious Minds, to get at it. She's more interested in MAGA. I've obviously spoken with you recently. I've got it on the previous slides about Stephen Tellis's book, The Conservative Legal Movement. One of the things that's interesting is to note where the points of overlap are. So the background assumption for the MAGA movement is that we're in the midst of a civilizational battle, that the liberals, that the post-traditionalists, the globalists, those who favor immigrants and the immigrants themselves are fundamentally undermining the background culture that has made America great, prosperous, that supports our institutions functioning, that when you dilute that culture, when you let too many people in who don't believe in it, or when over generational turnover, those values cease to have authority or conviction on the part of new generations, then the culture that sustains the success of the United States is being eroded. And this results in a worldview that suggests that we are facing an existential threat, a catastrophe for Christianity. And so the idea of Christian nationalism, I think, captures this very well, and that this is also a catastrophe for our country and for many of the people in this country. And I do think one of the reasons that this view resonates with so many Americans is so many Americans feel that the country is in decline, that their ability to prosper in this country has been substantially eroded, and they're looking for an easy, straightforward explanation of that. And the idea that this country worked better for them when there were fewer immigrants, when people were less liberal or woke, when more people subscribed to traditional gender roles, traditional Christian religious values, has a certain plausibility. I do not believe it is an accurate explanation. I need to be as clear as possible about that. The idea that we shouldn't confuse correlation with causation. We have become a post-traditional culture, and the ability of many Americans to see their way to intergenerational mobility, to doing better economically, come together, coincide, occur at the same period. But that doesn't mean the former explains the latter. I don't think it is the case that because we have more immigrants, because women are more equal, because there was a right to abortion, because fewer people are reproducing spontaneously their parents' religious values, I don't think that accounts for the decline of the middle class. I think that's much more to do about the decline of unions, about global labor competition, about the gutting of progressive taxation and the kinds of services that our government provided. By the way, that's what the Powell the Powell memorandum was really about. If you remember, Lewis Powell wrote that memorandum when he was working with the American Chamber of Commerce, who wanted deregulation so that corporations could become more profitable. That's the real explanation. And by the way, it suits the right very well to change the focus of animus away from corporate America, away from the hyper wealthy, and on to immigrants. But, right, coming back to, right, the fundamental political stance now, we're in the midst of an existential civilizational battle in which the values that sustain America, make us great, make us prosperous, are being undermined, and therefore we need to be on war footing. And so Donald Trump tweets out something I believe misattributes to Napoleon. He who saves the country does not violate any laws, right? And so there's a hostility to the slow, tedious, often ineffective processes through which law is made in the United States. That is to say, through the legislature, especially when the majority is so narrow that it's impossible for it to do much by way of legislation, and hostility to the rule of law when it interferes with the strong leader fighting the fight to save our civilization, the weak institutions of the Constitution, the slow, right, progress of our legislative structure, the checks and balances that make it impossible for an executive to be a strong man. These don't work in these circumstances. And as Justice Jackson said a century ago, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. If we want to save the culture that makes the Constitution work, we may need to violate or suspend constitutional values for a while. And this is where I think, right, MAGA Republicans, right, who believe that Donald Trump is the only leader who understands the threat and is willing to act with the decisive boldness this struggle requires, comes together with the conservative legal movement and with the way in which it is licensing much more executive action than, frankly, we have seen in the United States since World War II or the Watergate period. And so, right, I'm not going to go into all of the details of the most recent Supreme Court term. I want to focus on the forest and not the trees, and I do believe, in a sense, the sum is larger than the parts. We are seeing a transition into a new era of constitutional law, one in which the Supreme Court is much less sympathetic to the rights that I think were the most important for many Americans in the second half of the 20th century. The rights that we associate with civil rights, the rights that we associate with racial equality and with equal enfranchisement, equal protection of individual autonomy, including, right, sexual autonomy, the ability to control our procreative freedom, or to marry who we want. The Supreme Court seems very skeptical of that. At the same time, the constitutional accommodation of independent agencies, right? The Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communication Commission, right? There are a dozen or more of them. The consensus of the three branches for the last 100 years, right? Congress created these agencies. Presidents signed this legislation and abided by the limits on their executive power that the creation of independent agencies represents. And Supreme Courts, going all the way back to Humphrey's executor 95 years ago, also said Congress gave this power, which is really delegated congressional or regulatory legislative power, to the executive on the condition that it be constrained, limited, checked, have kinds of oversight that prevent it from being hijacked by one president's partisan or individual whims or will. This is right now been undone. So we're beginning a new era of rights limitations, tying the hands of Congress to pass or enforce the Voting Rights Act, and preventing courts from issuing nationwide injunctions, from reviewing whether or not the decision to revoke temporary protective status is in fact done according to the congressionally required procedure, right? No, courts can't protect rights, Congress cannot protect rights, and therefore the executive is free to violate rights. And a new era of unilateral executive authority over powers concentrated in an administrative state that are profoundly dangerous if unchecked. That gets us back to Thursday night speech. The President of the United States should not have the power to demand that his national security agencies, the Department of Justice, that the FBI, produce propaganda and disinformation using classified information to foster his false claims, right? This is not the reason Congress gave these tremendous powers to the executive, yet this is now the new normal. That the president can unilaterally use all of this power for whatever partisan or megalomaniacal aim he has in mind. I have on the board, right, the idea that those who have been charged with assaulting immigration agents, nearly, I think it's actually 50% of those cases have been dismissed. These are cases brought by the U.S. Department of Justice, dismissed or acquitted, I should say. And please note that in the regular operation of the Department of Justice, they get something like a 90% conviction rate. The idea that they are pursuing cases against people, and look at how many have been dismissed, right? The judge has basically said there's not enough evidence to even proceed with this trial. The Department of Justice is bringing these cases not because people have engaged in criminal behavior, actually assaulted immigration officials, Department of Homeland Security officials, but because this is a tool of intimidation to prevent people from protesting. Fuck around and find out, they say again and again and again. We will shoot you. If we don't shoot you, we will bring you up on trumped up charges if you try to exercise your constitutional right to protest. And so the Supreme Court is aware of this and is licensing this administration, an administration that shows little understanding of, let alone respect for the rule of law, that has a great admiration for strongman politics, that violates rights and abuses powers routinely. And now the Supreme Court is basically dismantling the way in which we have conventionally tried to check and restrain executive abuse of power. We see SCOTUS, right, the Supreme Court, right, dismantling these checks precisely as we see this administration rushing to construct the infrastructure of a police state within the confines of what had hitherto been a democratically accountable executive branch, and moving more quickly than Hungary, Venezuela, Russia, or Turkey. And that it's in this context then that I want to think about Thursday's primetime address, and the idea that we have an effort to expand the autocratic capacities before the Democratic Party, civil society actors, or institutions rise up to challenge this. I think this is what we're laying the groundwork for. And I'll say it very quickly, right? Thursday night's explicit call was for Congress to authorize the Save America Act. I don't believe it had any effect in that regard. it appears that that act is dead, that there is too little Republican support to pass it, and that's in part because some Republicans live in states that actually rely on mail-in voting. But I'll also say this very quickly. I don't think that that is, right, the true objective of this speech. I think that in essence, Donald Trump wants to be able to say, I gave Congress every opportunity to do this. I'm now going to declare an emergency and do it unilaterally via executive action. And by the way, right, I have on the board over 60 actions that the Trump administration has taken to try to intervene in our elections. Many of these have been disallowed by judges, and some of them have legal action pending right now. But I just want to be as clear as possible. For 10 years or longer, right? How does Donald Trump come to, right, national prominence as a political figure? First, by challenging the very idea that Barack Obama is a citizen of the country. What would it mean if the President of the United States were not a citizen of the country? It would mean that our institutions are so corrupt that they cannot detect the most obvious, minimal requirement of electoral integrity, that the person elected to the highest office in the land actually be qualified for that office, right? So it goes back over a decade, but it has been relentless, tireless, and right now is cresting in the buildup to this election. And by the way, Trump v. Slaughter, the case that establishes the unitary executive theory that strikes down the Humphreys executive decision, overturns, right, that decision from nearly 100 years ago that had established, right, the ability of Congress to appoint independent boards. This is going to make it much easier for Donald Trump to continue this campaign. So, right, we have Mullen, right, threatening election officials with prison times if they don't collaborate. We have all of these executive actions conducted by the Department of Justice, the Director of National Intelligence, the U.S. Postal Service, right? Bill Pulte being put in charge of national intelligence precisely because Trump understands that he will do his dirty work for him, abusing power to declassify secrets. But I want to focus on one thing in particular, right? The Postal Service beginning to explore blocking mail-in ballots in states that do not turn over their voting records to the federal government, to Trump's administration, right? Let me just add by way of background. I don't know if you saw this. This is relatively recent, but we learned this week, among other things, that the Department of Homeland Security gained access to Medicaid and Medicare records and used them in their efforts to go after the people they want to deport. Not only that, they took these records, right, which should not have been in their possession. That was a violation of the law, and gave them to Palantir to integrate into their database, which ICE and Customs and Border Patrol uses to go after those they want to deport. The idea that this administration is demonstrably insecure, lawless, and it is a dangerous thing to give them your sensitive information. And now, right, the Postal Service is saying if 30 states don't give over their information, we won't deliver their mail-in ballots, right? This is the extent, and please note, right, that this has been litigated. A judge has put a temporary order to suspend this from happening. It's not happening, right? But this is just indicative of the extreme measures that this president is willing to go to, that his administration, that his party in Congress as well, are willing to license in order to prevent the American people from using what is a sound and reliable electoral system to express their will if their will contravenes, right, what the president of the United States wants to do or diminishes the power of this party. This is, again, a new normal. And I think we have to get used to the idea that the Supreme Court of the United States is not going to protect us, that one of our two main parties has become an anti-institutionalist, anti-democratic, autocratic legalist party. It is not playing by the old rules. The evidence is ample that it is trying every lever it can to undermine our electoral system, to produce the outcomes that it wants, even if that involves explicitly lying to the American people, abusing power, overriding elections. This is a new normal as well. All right, so I know I've used up my time. Why don't I open it up to discussion? Eager to hear what you have to say. Who wants to start us out? Flossie, got to unmute yourself. I think you're familiar with that, but
Can you hear me?
good job. Yes.
Yes. What worries me may be insignificant. I do not think so. But last week in the Chronicle, there was a stunning picture.
Flossie, we lost you. Push that.
I'm saying that she was naked, virtually naked, standing on cubes of wood so she could be seen at an intersection. She was selling her young body. You could see enough of the body so that you knew it was a body, but it was a skinny body. And this kid,
We lost. Okay.
right, not only in the middle of an intersection where cars make a turn, but there was a car ready to receive her. She looked rather interesting. Now, I recollect in the 1900s that in Oakland, on the freeway, on the highway, we would have beautiful women, experienced prostitutes, decked out in gorgeous costumes, who would get in and out of the cars. They were soliciting and they were being received. Now, that can be fun for some, it can be disease for others, it can be a question of women's rights, but it has to be examined as something that has potential fire. We have we've had enough with COVID. We don't need more diseases that become take on another a possibility of infection. But to see a kid standing on two blocks of wood, offering her body for sale, of course, the roving reporter had this was a story. It was drama. It was women's rights. If that's what you want to do, kid, go for it. But it's also mixed up with whether or not our legislators, our lawgivers, can do something about that. It's ugly, it's sick. There are other ways to enjoy life.
Thank
Forgive
you.
me for being an old poorly dirty. That's
Thank you, Flossie. And so I'm gonna take what you're saying in a slightly different direction, if you'll let me. And so um, uh, I think there's a really interesting debate to be had about who suffers from the criminalization of prostitution most. And I think one thing that many feminists point out is if we want to criminalize prostitution, what we should really do is go after what we call the Johns, right? The men buying sex. And it's not always men, but it's almost always men, right? And we should go after in particular the traffickers, the pimps. And so if there are women who are genuinely freely choosing from a position that allows them the freedom not to choose to sell sex, then I think there is an argument to be made that regulated in the right way, so that we address issues to do with sexually transmitted diseases and the exploitation of the women, that this should be a legal, regulated, protected profession. But having said that, that's obviously miles away from the reality of sex work in the United States. And the reality of sex work in the United States is that the vast majority of women who are in it have been trafficked and are coerced, and are many of them underage, most of them exploited, put in danger, many of them, right, trafficked from foreign countries. And so here's the peculiar segue, which I'll just develop for a second. I think one of the tragedies of the politicization of the Epstein files in the way that they have been politicized, right? Using them as an effort to expose the deep state, or to try to suggest that Bill and Hillary Clinton, etc., are caught up in this nefarious network, has been that we have not used it as an opportunity to take a serious look into the nature of the trafficking of women for sex work and the impunity with which wealthy people take advantage of the women who are trafficked in that way. That there was a way to take what is so awful in the Epstein files and use it as an opportunity to learn about how to address this problem. And rather than doing that, right, in this information system that we occupy, this opportunity was lost, wasted, and something very different came about instead. Anne, I see you've got your hand up. Flossie, give me a second. Do you want to be brief? Because Anne's had her hand up for a long time. You're muted, Flossie.
See your point. It can actually be used against some of our legislators who do traffic in sex and have been accused of rape, and all of the nasty publicity that can be used against perhaps some good men who have made mistakes. It can be used in that direction. That's not what worried me.
I
I
understand.
worry about kids who have no other way of looking at what they will do with their lives,
Yeah.
and who see no other way, and they find it perhaps rather interesting until they get caught.
Uh,
And we have not forgotten how apt our present president was happy to receive the services of young women.
okay,
So
Flossie, thank you. And I want to have Anne have an opportunity. E. Jane Carroll, by the way, among the news of the week, got her $5+ million, not yet her $70 million. But yes, you do point out it's not just our legislators or our candidates, it's our presidents. And go ahead.
Going back to one of the earlier new normals, in talking about climate change,
Mm-hmm.
I find it interesting and worrying that one of the policies, or among the policies here, is to do everything possible to keep us on coal and oil.
Yes.
The removal of the windmills, etc. I mean, there's hundreds of examples, and I really don't really understand that. Is it just the power of the oil industry?
Oh, absolutely. Let me try to unpack that for a second. And I'm going to start with Bill McKibbins, who some of you may know is both one of the leading scholars and activists on climate change and one of the co-founders of Third Act, which is the political activism for people over 60 umbrella organization. And it's, for instance, enlisting people who are retired and have considerable investments or retirement accounts to use their financial power to punish industries that continue to protect or promote the use of fossil fuel. So Bill McKibben's an interesting man, and he's referring to what Donald Trump is doing with having paid out over $1 billion to dismantle wind turbines, right? Having subsidized the production of coal, having removed all of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies for the development of new jobs and new industries to do with battery power or solar power or the expansion of the electrical grid. He's referred to this, I think, as the single most destructive exercise of economic self undermining in the history of the world, right? That we were poised in the aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act to perhaps gain a foothold in what is going to be the most important economic developments in the energy sector for the remainder of this century. The transition into away from fossil into solar, into wind, into tide, into sustainable sources of energy, the development of batteries to capture and store that electricity, the development of transmission lines. This is the future, right? And we were poised to begin to compete. China is so far ahead of us. I think it's an uphill battle. But as opposed to doing that, Donald Trump removed the incentives, paid the companies that had got the federal licenses to do the wind power, paid them $1 billion+ to take those licenses away from them because they'd already invested in doing it and gave more money to coal. So how do you explain this? I think there are two prongs to this. The first is that Donald Trump promised the fossil fuel industry, right? Promised the leaders of that industry, you give me $1 billion to get elected, and I will make it worth your while. Right. And please note, Donald Trump doesn't keep promises because he's an honest or honorable man. Donald Trump keeps promises when it's in his and his party's interest to do so. And he recognizes that being in a world in which all of the fossil fuel money goes to the Republican Party is good for the Republican Party. And so he is following through on what he said he would do, even if it is catastrophic for our environment and destructive for our economic future. So that's right. The first explanation. The second explanation is Donald Trump understands that there is a segment of the American population that is deeply hostile to what they think of as woke liberal ideas. And driving an electrical vehicle, having solar panels on your house, being concerned about climate change has come to be associated with the kinds of problems that the economic elite care about, and that ordinary people have more urgent things to worry about. And so if you worry about the climate change stuff, it marks you as someone who has profited from globalization, which has damaged the working class. It is a potent cultural war issue in the 21st century. And I showed you the diagram. I know we went through it pretty quickly, but we're at near peak worry about climate change in the United States. I imagine it will go even higher next year because we're going to see, I think if this is right, more droughts, more fires, more flooding. It's not going to be a good year. And so more people will be worried. More homes will be lost to mudslides and flooding and fire. And more people will have their daily routines interrupted by unbreathable air, etc. That worry will go up, but it's still less than 50% of the population. And I do think we live in this bifurcated world. If you're watching Fox News, climate change is the kind of thing that woke liberals worry about, not the kind of thing that real Americans who want the right to drive whatever car they want and use whatever kind of light bulb they want worry about. So yeah, it's both of those explanations. He is trying to keep the fossil fuel industry fully aligned with the Republican Party, and he recognizes the potency of this issue as a culture war issue. And for both of those reasons, he's doing this stuff that is profoundly destructive to the planet and to our economic future, and he doesn't give a damn. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ann. Anyone else for today? We've gone a little bit over. Happy to take another question, but if not, I'll let you guys go to lunch. Great being with you as always. Look, I had dark in the title. I pulled in a couple of the silver linings. I do think the stuff on the transition to alternative energy sources, by the way, the fact that gas prices are so volatile and look likely to rise going forward is going to further accelerate the transition to alternatives to fossil fuel. It can't happen soon enough, but it does appear to be happening. Be well, everyone. Take care. Look forward to seeing you next week. Hope you enjoy, if you're rooting, the World Cup final. I'll see you all next Saturday. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure as always. Bye, guys.
Bye.